people, first trying to enlist a thoroughly disinterested Senate, then a willing but dead-too-soon son, before he finally settled on a supposedly hyper-loyal Praetorian prefect named Lucius Sejanus, who proved to have only his own interests at heart. After the fall of Sejanus, though, Tiberius simply stopped looking for a partner to bear his burdens for him. That is not to say that he actually began to embrace the dull responsibilities of office. Quite the contrary. After Sejanus was executed, Tiberius attended to the empire even less than before. Had it not been for the inertia of the imperial bureaucracy, the empire likely would have devolved into another round of chaotic civil wars the minute ambitious men realized that there was no one manning the helm anymore. But the apparatus Augustus had set up turned out to be self-perpetuating enough to survive 6 years of utter neglect by his successor. In his last years, Tiberius was famously obsessed with two things. One, purging Rome of anything resembling a threat to his power, and two, indulging his own increasingly, inappropriate fetishes. We'll deal with the latter in a moment, but as to the former, in the early 30s BC, Tiberius unleashed a terror on Rome that dwarfed anything perpetuated by Sejanus. I've been thinking a lot about these cycles of violence that have been plaguing Rome for the last century. I searched for the word purge in the manuscript, and other than a passing reference to Hannibal being a virus that needed to be purged from the Roman body, the word literally does not show up until episode 34, Marius and Sulla. But since then, it is a vocabulary word that I've been turning to with frightening regularity. Marius purges Sulla's supporters. Sulla purges Marius' supporters. The Second Triumvirate purges the Republicans. The Second Triumvirate purges each other. Lucius Sejanus purges his political enemies, and now Tiberius is about to purge anyone connected to Sejanus. Julius Caesar was the only one of them who refused to join in the fun, and guess what happened to him? That's right, murdered on the steps of Pompey's theater. There is definitely something to be said for the Romans emerging as the dominant power in the Mediterranean in the mid-100s BC. Annihilating the Carthaginians and conquering the Greeks left the Romans with nothing to keep their politics from turning into life-and-death struggles. No threat from a foreign other remained to bind the competing political factions to one another. The number of men and women killed in intra-Roman feuds prior to 150 BC is practically nil. The number killed after, too many to count. And here we are again, another round of bloody, violent purges. And believe me, this won't be going away anytime soon. With the state apparatus firmly now in the hands of a single man, if that man turned out to be cruel or paranoid, well, the state simply followed his lead. Tiberius turned out to be cruel and paranoid, and his vehicle for inflicting his wrath on the population of Rome was an escalation of his treason trials. Prescriptions may have been fine for the wild days of yore, but since the beginning of his reign, Tiberius had slowly codified something far more horrific. There is something terrible about being consumed by violent chaos, but I think there is something far more terrifying about being consumed by violent order. After the rise and fall of Sejanus, Tiberius let his perfectly insane, Kafkaesque legal system off its leash and allowed it to consume everyone. Evidence didn't matter, rationality didn't matter. All that mattered was that you had been fingered, or knew someone who had been fingered. I shudder when I think about living under such circumstances. And unfortunately for the people of Rome, there was little they could do about it. As long as the leadership of the Praetorian Guard and the frontier armies were staffed with men loyal to the emperor, there was no fighting back. There was a comment in the thread to last week's episode from listener Mike, wondering where the rest of the legion stood on all of this, and why they didn't push back against the growing power of the Praetorian Guard. The answer is that at the top, the generals appointed to lead the army were men chosen carefully by the emperor, and their loyalty to the regime was their most important qualification for office. Beneath the loyal generals, most of the professional officers in the armies were actually angling themselves for a spot in the Praetorian Guard. They didn't want to push back against the Praetorian Guard's new influence, they wanted to join in the fun. So the civilian population was left at the mercy of the regime. The primary targets of this round of purges were first and foremost families who had connections to Sejanus. The fallen prefect had earned himself many enemies during his rise to power, but he also gained many friends as well. With the fall of Sejanus, those friends joined their patron and were themselves accused, tried, and convicted of treason. Some were exiled, others committed suicide, but most, being unable or unwilling to escape the shame of it, were executed. The property, as usual, was seized and folded into the imperial treasury. But not content to focus all of his attention on Sejanus' partisans, Tiberius also welcomed the opportunity to persecute senatorial and equestrian families, having opposed his regime from the very beginning. Praetorian spies spread themselves throughout the city, and the slightest slip of the tongue, say, complaining at a party that it sure did stink that your old friend had just committed suicide after being caught up in crazy Tiberius's treason trials, meant that you yourself were about to be caught up in crazy Tiberius's treason trials. Tacitus describes that the trials paid no heed to gender or age. Senior citizens, children, men and women were all hauled before the courts, tried, and executed. Heaps of bodies began to pile up, and it became a crime to even linger where the corpses lay and mourn a dead friend or relative for too long. It also became a crime to attempt to bury or cremate the condemned dead, whose bodies were treated as those of common criminals, left to rot in the streets or dragged with hooks into the Tiber River. It was a dark time for Rome, and the veil would not be lifted until Tiberius was dead, though we know now that the lifted veil would crash right back down after Caligula arrived and revealed his true colors. While all this was going on, Tiberius remained on Capri, approving lists of victims, but otherwise leaving the empire to its own devices. So what exactly filled the hours of his day? Well, the stories that have come down to us were mostly written after Tiberius's reputation had taken a nosedive, so it's tough to say where fact ends and slander begins. But let's just say that his inhibitions were no longer a factor in his actions. This is a family podcast, and I once upon a time marked the show as clean within the iTunes library, so I would hate to betray that trust by describing in detail what Tiberius was allegedly up to in the last years of his reign, but I will say that just like the treason trials, gender and age did not matter, and also like the treason trials, his victims wound up murdered, supposedly thrown from the cliffs at his villa on Capri when he grew bored with them or was simply not satisfied any longer. The specifics of his alleged depravities can be found in both Suetonius or Tacitus if you would like a full accounting, but just keep in mind that I think a lot of it is probably exaggeration. The final takeaway from the tales of Tiberius's perversions should be that by the time the second emperor of Rome was dead, the people hated and despised him, and were eager to utterly trash his reputation. The only silver lining Romans could see in the horror of Tiberius's final years was that the old man would soon be dead, and they would get a chance to start over with a new emperor. It's not like the next man could possibly be as bad as the old bloodthirsty pervert Tiberius. Enter to the stage, please, Gaius Julius Caesar Caligula, the man who would prove that you should never put your trust in the notion that at least it can't get any worse. Because guess what? It can always get worse. Gaius Julius Caesar, the third and youngest son of Germanicus and Agrippina, was born in 12 AD and raised in the legionary camps. It was common practice at the time for a general to take his family with him on assignment, so when Germanicus was put in charge of the legions on the Rhine following the death of Augustus, his wife Agrippina and children, which at this point included 8-year-old Nero, 7-year-old Drusus, and 2-year-old Gaius, went with him. Young Gaius became something of a mascot for the soldiers under Germanicus' command, and the toddler was outfitted with a little army man outfit that he would wear around camp, prompting the soldiers to give him Caligula, or boots, after the adorable version of the sandal boots that the boy would march around in. I should note at this point that while history calls him Caligula, in his time as emperor he was known simply as Gaius. The nickname only came back into use after his death, frequently with ironic derision. When Germanicus was reposted to Syria in 17 AD, the family, now joined by the girls Agrippina the Younger and Drusilla, dutifully followed along, and when Germanicus died 2 years later, the children, including now the infant Julia Livilla, returned to Rome with Agrippina. The next decade would be difficult for Agrippina and her children. Deathly afraid that any man who married Germanicus' widow would immediately become a powerful rival, Tiberius forbade Agrippina to remarry. This left the family adrift with no other paterfamilias than Tiberius himself, who hated and feared the whole lot of them. Caligula managed to stay below Tiberius' radar when the paranoid old man decided he couldn't stand the family any longer and prosecuted for treason Agrippina and the 2 elder boys Nero and Drusus. With their mother and elder brothers dead, the remaining children were shunted off to live with their grandmother Antonia, who looked after them for the next few years. The girls were one by one married off at Tiberius's orders, while Caligula remained in a sort of limbo. After the fall of Sejanus, though, Tiberius gave enough passing thought to a successor that he called for Caligula to come live with him on Capri. The young future emperor seems to have managed to avoid crossing Tiberius during the 6 years he spent as a virtual prisoner on the island by repressing all the fear and resentment he likely felt towards the old man, and pretended to be nothing less than the pliant servant of the aging emperor. In 33 AD, Caligula was given an honorary quaestorship, the only official office he would hold before becoming the supreme ruler of the empire, and also in that year, he married Junia Claudilla, though the union would only survive until Junia's death in childbirth a year later. In 35 AD, Tiberius changed his will to take some account for succession, ordering that his estate, and thus the throne, jointly fall to Caligula and Tiberius's grandson, Tiberius Gemellus, the only surviving son of the ill-fated marriage between Drusus and Livilla. Unlike Augustus, who had obsessed over succession and spent a great deal of his energy readying his potential successors, first Marcellus, then Tiberius and Drusus, then Gaius and Lucius, Tiberius seems to have done nothing to prepare Caligula or Gemellus for imperial responsibility. Gemellus at this point was barely even a teenager. In 37 AD, death finally came knocking for Tiberius, though the details of his final moments are the source of some debate. Some sources claim that the now 77-year-old emperor who had ruled Rome for 23 years simply passed away in his sleep. Another, more colorful account is that the emperor was reported to have finally succumbed to a fatal illness, which prompted the people of Rome to begin celebrating his death. But then another report followed right on the heels of the first, stating that the emperor had actually recovered. Then a third and final report came, stating that the emperor's recovery was a fiction, and the report was issued by the Praetorian prefect Naevius Sutorius Macro, who had gone in to confirm for himself the death of the emperor. And by confirm the death of the emperor himself, I of course mean smother with a pillow the weak but fully recovered Tiberius. A third version of the story points to Caligula as the murderer, but since this version was recounted by Caligula himself, in an attempt to be seen as the man who finally delivered Rome from his wicked grandfather, I think we can safely dismiss this version. Caligula was also fond of telling people that he used to creep into Tiberius's room at night and stand over the sleeping emperor with a brandished knife, and would refrain from doing what he felt was right, namely murdering the evil Tiberius, only at the behest of the divine Augustus, whose voice commanded him to be patient and let nature take its course. Yeah, Caligula was nuts. However it happened, Tiberius was dead, and the people rejoiced. Such was the depth of their hatred for him, that rather than calling for elaborate funeral arrangements, they simply cried out, "To the Tiber with Tiberius." They wanted to do to him what he had done to them, and treat his body as nothing more than a corpse of a criminal, drag it through the streets of Rome on hooks, and then deposit it unceremoniously into the river. The people did not get their way, though, and a formal funeral and cremation were arranged. But Tiberius was conspicuously not granted the same divine honors the Senate had tripped over itself bestowing upon Augustus. Though Tiberius's will specified that Caligula and Gemellus should jointly rule the empire, Caligula had no interest in sharing power. The shrinking violet mask he had worn for years to avoid Tiberius's wrath was now cast aside. Having likely arranged in advance with Macro that when the day came, the Praetorian prefect would figure